Hello, my name is Chuck Wolf. Over the years, I've worked in many different roles, including leading my own leadership consulting company since 1994. I've worked for and with some of the best companies and universities in the world, and have had the opportunity to work with government officials, military organizations, and public and private schools. I'm a leading expert and pioneer in emotional intelligence. Since 2009, I have been a volunteer hosting a radio show I created called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. I really enjoy making a difference in people's lives. The show is on award-winning community radio station, WPKN in Bridgeport, Connecticut. In recent years, Simsbury Community Television has been sharing my shows on their station and on YouTube. My sincere hope is that everyone who watches regularly will learn how to use the Emotion Roadmap in their own lives by listening to people who call in to get help with challenges at work, home, and in communities. To learn more, go to www.emotionroadmap.com. If you have a comment or question, email me at cjwolf@cjwolf.com. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hi, I'm Chuck Wolf, and this is the Emotion Roadmap. Take the wheel and control how you feel. And you're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM, listener-supported community radio. And according to the New Yorker, the best little radio station in the world. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's nice to have people tuning in that are regular listeners. Thank you for tuning in and regularly listening. And also, for anybody that might be new to the show, I'll spend a moment just telling you about the show. So again, it's called the Emotion Roadmap. Take the wheel and control how you feel. And what I've done over the past 13 years now, that's 13 years the show is on the air. We're on the air on the first and second Wednesdays of each month from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And I just have been on the air trying to help people deal with challenging situations in their lives where emotions seem to be playing a key role. I want to help people based on the science of emotional intelligence, my work in the field with some of the pioneers, my own work in creating the Emotion Roadmap, to help you discover ways that you might be more successful in managing your own emotions and having influence over people that you care about or simply people that you need to work with. But in any case, this show is about taking callers who have challenges in their lives, who are interested in finding out how the Emotion Roadmap might be beneficial to them. That's what you'll hear normally. So when I take phone calls, I walk people through this Emotion Roadmap I created, which is simply a way of using the science of emotions, the art of understanding each of us and who we are and how we're unique, and trying to blend the art and the science and helping you discover ways that you can be more effective, more impactful for yourself and for others. But today I have a guest on my show. On occasion, I find people in the world who are pioneers in the field of emotional intelligence who have a lot that they're contributing, and I'd like to bring those people's work to our audience. And one of those people is a good friend now, Max Ghini, who I've known since the early 2000s, where we first met at a conference on emotional intelligence in the Netherlands many years ago. And we're going to talk about teams. We're going to talk about remote team members, about how to be a really excellent team leader and team member. We're going to talk a little bit about elevating people in the workplace, a bit about women in particular. So I did some work for Max recently for the University of Bologna on women, elevating women in leadership roles in Italy. So let me tell you a little bit about Max. Max is a people management professor at Bologna Business School, human resource management adjunct professor at the University of Bologna. Since 2000, he's been dealing with emotional intelligence in leadership, in change processes, and in teamwork. He loves neuroscience and the brain-based approach to business. Max is the co-author of the books Vital Organization and Inside Change, co-author of the 6 Seconds Emotional Intelligence Assessment, and of the Vital Science Tools to Measure the Drivers of Performance, and the author of several articles and white papers. In 2006, Max had been a candidate at the Aspen Institute Faculty Pioneer Award for the significant contribution to the field of business and society, particularly through his innovative research and tools related to emotional intelligence. From 2012 to 2017, he served as a board member at 6 Seconds, the Emotional Intelligence Network. For those of you that have been listening to me for a number of years, you might know that I interviewed the president and the chief executive of the organization for 6 seconds, actually a few years back. It's a wonderful organization you may want to learn more about, actually. In 2015, 2017, 2019, and 2020, Max won the Best Teacher Award for Executive Masters at Bologna Business School. One of his mantras is Peter Drucker's statement, your foremost job as leader is to take charge of your own energy and then orchestrate the energy of others. So, with no further ado, let me introduce you to Max Ghini. So, Max, welcome to the show. And is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you?
Of course, I'm flattered by this kind presentation, Chuck. So, what a pleasure to be here with you and discuss about emotional intelligence. So, no, I wouldn't like to add anything after this so kind presentation. Thank you very much.
Great.
Really.
Well, Max, as I said, we've known each other for a number of years. Your experience in Italy is somewhat unique. I have met a few other people working in emotional intelligence in Italy, but could you tell us a little bit about the state of the art in Italy and just what people that might have some interest in knowing how is emotional intelligence making any kind of difference in Italy, and particularly in your own work at the University of Bologna?
Well, that's an opportunity to tell you a little bit about why I'm in the emotional intelligence field. Because in early 2000, I was struggling with a performance management system. In companies, we have these tools where we define goals, then we provide feedbacks, and then there's a final feedback or evaluation. And one of the things that made me crazy is that you invested a lot of time, a lot of money, and the results of this system risk to be and higher the motivation. And it's quite crazy. I mean, you invest a lot and the result is the motivation. Well, if your goal is the motivation, you can do it for free. You don't need to invest, of course. And so the question for me was, what's the missing point? I mean, because from a rational point of view, this kind of system was perfect in terms of literature, in terms of research, and so on. And the real point was the lack of emotions. Because the real point here is about emotions. And in Italy, and it's quite strange because in terms of culture, we are really open to emotions. We show emotions, and it's part of our culture. But when we think about business, we tend to be, or we try to be, or I mean, we are supposed to be rational and rational oriented. And I had the opportunity in the early 2000 to go to London or UK, and because there was a conference about emotional intelligence, and it was my first approach because I said, okay, if the rational is not enough, what's the answer? And so I found this interesting conference, and the first point for me was, okay, guys, it makes sense. Finally, we start from the brain and how we work, because the risk is, in my opinion, or in my experience, well, if we start from the brain, it's easier to understand and to work on. But, I teach at the Faculty of Management Engineering. And so one of the points was, is it measurable? Is it something we can measure, really? Because I can say in one of the company, okay, let's talk about emotions. Because the risk was at the beginning of the century to be perceived as touchy-feely, not serious, not really business-oriented. And so in Italy, it's quite strange, just to answer to your question, but from a cultural point of view, we are open to emotion. In terms of business, we are really close, or at least we were. Now the situation is getting better, but we are not where I supposed to be maybe 10 years ago, when I thought about what is my vision, what I envision for Italy or for the corporate world in general. And if you think, the Goleman's book is 1995, so more than 25 years. So now it's time to practice not only talking about emotions. So the situation in Italy is quite strange in terms of the use of emotions. What I'm seeing is even in parenting now is growing the willingness, even from the fatherhood's point of view, to work more on emotions and so on. So it's a growing wave, but we are not where we need to be in order to face all the difficult situation we have around us.
That's interesting, Max. I think a couple of points. One is it's interesting that you mentioned the conference in the UK, because I was actually a speaker. It was linkage. It was the first pan-European conference on emotional intelligence, and it was the first time I was actually I'd been working with Peter Salovey and David Caruso, and then Jack May was at the conference, and I presented. This is the first time I was meeting Jack, although we talked on the phone. But this is the first time he sat and listened to my presentation. And he came up and said to me afterwards, because I had created this emotion roadmap, it was the very beginnings of it at that point. And he said, I never knew our model could be that useful. Thanks, Chuck. Because he was struggling. Peter and Jack, both wonderful academics and brilliant in what they did, but they weren't really thinking about application. They were thinking about research and about science. And to your point, in what we experienced in America was that we were told to leave our emotions at the door when you came into work. We were saying, emotion, to your point, rational was what drove business. And of course, if you really looked and you were willing to look at what emotions actually were in play, power and greed were clearly emotions that were being displayed in the workplace, right? A lot of people are driven by how good can I do? What can I achieve? Now part of it was achievement, but also it was, what can I do for me, for my family, but also how much can I accumulate? And so there was a lot of things that were happening at the time that, but they were never talked about as emotions. They weren't described that way. And I think, to your point, for some reason, we felt like we could leave emotions outside of the door at the workplace and focus on being rational. As you said, you have goals, you have measurements, you have check-in points where you look at how you're doing. Why wouldn't that work? And I think one of the most interesting experiences I've had over the years was one of the people I got to know somewhat many years ago. I worked at Harvard Business School and got to know a fellow named John Carter, who was famous for his change management. He was one of the most significant people in the world as a professor or consultant on change management. Well, John was a data geek. John loved data. And I know as an engineer, you love data too. But John was like driven. I mean, he's probably the most analytic person I'd ever met in my life. But it was many years into his experience as a consultant in change that he realized that emotions have a critical role to play in many of the experiences he was looking at in terms of trying to orchestrate organizational change failed because they didn't pay attention to emotions. Now, I don't know if that's a similar experience to what people are feeling in Italy or not, but this was the beginning of a groundswell of people saying, when Dan wrote his book in 1995, he opened up the window and a lot of fresh air came in around how we look at and think about emotions. And so all of a sudden, there was an opportunity. But like many things, people thought, well, this will come and go too. This will fade, just like so many other innovative ideas have come, been here for a while. People embraced them, thought they were going to make the world a different place, and then they let go. But it seems to me emotional intelligence is different in that it's continuing to trench. Could you tell me how it's building in Italy over the years?
Well, let me say one thing, first of all. In terms of different perspective, as a European, the first time I've heard about emotional intelligence, I said, well, it's something new, because in my culture, humanism was something that we studied a lot. The people at the center was one of our main attributes, and so on. But the real struggle was to apply all these things, especially when we had around us more pressure. Because if you look at the management playbook, set goals, give feedback, and so on, it was okay in the 80s, because probably the pressure around us, the complexity around us was not the one we are experiencing now. And so the rational paradigm could be enough in order to accomplish all the goals. But now it's not possible. And now we are, especially after the last 2 years, we can say we need more. We cannot accomplish all the challenge we have just with the rational paradigm. We need to start on how we work. And the risk was in early 2000 to say, okay, there's an interesting concept, emotional intelligence. Okay, let's have a course, 2 days course. Okay, we got it. It's not about a training. It's about a practice. It's about understanding on how we can embed emotions and emotional processes like your roadmap in our daily job, but not only in the corporate environment, but in the family. Think about the challenges with the children and so on. Of course, the reality around us is a lot more complex, and we need to consider it. So rationality is not enough. And the winning point for me, for instance, at the business school, was to start from the brain. Because when I say emotional intelligence, yes, emotions, but we have serious things to do. Okay, let's start with neuroscience 101. Neuroscience, there's the word science, so it means that could be interesting. And they give you 10 minutes in order to grab their interest. And then they understand that the same things are going on in the work environment, but in the family, because emotions are contagious, because if you are not capable to understand the other emotions, you have problems. If you are not capable to manage your own emotion, to be aware. And so you discover that you take one class and you use, if you are able and willing to practice, in different fields of your life. You can use it in sports, in parenting, and so on. And that's an amazing discovery for lots of people. And so in Italy, we started with, okay, it's a new training. We need to do it. Now, the reality is quite different, because what we have experienced in the last years bring people to say, we need something different. We need more. We need to understand how to really have the opportunity to stay alive in this complex environment. And so now it's easy to say to people, okay, let's work on the emotional side of your business, of your family, or whatever.
It's interesting. So one of the things that you mentioned was it's sort of like the 1980s. It was enough to be rational. It seems to me at the time, the 1980s was the early part of that. I was at Harvard Business School, and one of the things that they were talking about there at the time was that the psychological or social contract that had existed in America anyway, where somebody would give their best years to a company. And towards the end of those years, even though they were making more money than somebody else who might be able to come in at a lower pay grade and was younger, could probably do some, or at least more, maybe even most of what these people were doing, they carried them. They carried them into retirement. There used to be the kind of thing where you get pensions. We don't have pensions anymore. You have to. We have a variation on the theme, but you don't get a monthly paycheck from your company where you'd grown up and had stayed for 30 or 40 years. And all that was changing in the 80s. And part of that was globalization. Part of that was, hey, you know what? I think if we want to, and then the argument was, if we want our customers to benefit from lower cost, we can produce our goods and our service, or at least our goods, in other countries where it's much cheaper and the labor is much less expensive. And so hey, we want to lower costs for customers. Sounds like a good idea until you realize the people all around you on your street, in your neighborhood, are losing their jobs to other people, other places, other countries. And the social contract was being broken. And so this idea of you go to work for a company and you stay with that company forever, that was a big change that was coming in the 80s. And I think we all kind of went through that. And yeah, there was a lot of emotional stuff taking place then. And I think people have struggled to replace that. I think over the years, one of the organizations that's I found fascinating, and Gallup, they do surveys all around the world on engagement. And you see there isn't a country that has higher levels of high engagement than around 30%. That's the top. Some countries as low as 6%. I won't say which country because it might have changed, but there's countries that really struggle. I don't know if you've at least been measuring that, but in the US, it's somewhere between 20 and 30% are highly engaged. That means 70% of the workforce isn't. That's a lot of people not doing what they could. And I think that's an emotional issue, Max. I think engagement is an emotional issue. What causes people to be engaged? How do you get more engagement? And if you get more engagement, you have more trust, you have more productivity, more profitability. And one of the ways you do that, by the way, is one of the things I was sharing with your students when I did the presentation for you, was you have more women in top management. It seems like when you have more women that are really, and this was a key finding too in the research I did for you, was it isn't just to have women in place, it's when they're valued. It's when they're appreciated. It's when there's there isn't just a token woman in a board setting or in a C-suite group of officers. It's more about that. But the whole concept, I think, has changed radically since the 80s. And so it's an interesting time you pointed out. And I think that the contract was broken. And what's there to replace it? And I think we're still struggling to figure that out.
And consider that if you think about Dan Kahneman, for instance, Nobel laureate 2002, the first research was 1973. It means that even in the 70s, you could say, well, probably we are not so rational as we think we are. So it was easier, or at least for a genius like Dan Kahneman, was easy to see that emotions and biases and so on impacted on your capability to decide. But it's not the case that he won the Nobel in 2002, because it was clear in early 2000 that the world has shifted to a different kind of complexity. And then it was not about a strange research on how we decide and so on, but it was natural to say, okay, let's restart and see how people really work. Think about, for instance, the idea to say to someone, you have to study 3 pages and so on. What does it mean? You have to read and repeat. Is it the right word? I mean, how can I learn something? Sometimes we use the human being as a black box. You give inputs and you are expecting outputs. What goes on inside, you don't know it. Now, with neurosciences and all the research we have done, we have not the overall clarity, of course, because it's so complex, but we know more, and we need to use it inside our companies, inside our families, because now we know. And the example I did with the Goleman's book, we all know, we as a researcher and practitioner, that Salovey Meyer, with the article, underlined this idea of emotional intelligence. Goleman had the incredible capability to create the bestseller. And around the world, in 1995, I remember a time cover about EQ, emotional quotient, and so on. It was really, really interesting, and lots of people talked about that. But then, no consistency in really build these life skills in some way in schools and companies and so on. And that's, of course, a mess.
Well, it's interesting, Max, because I think Dan was a writer. He didn't do a lot of his own research, but he was brilliant at bringing other people's research to life in ways that people that were not statisticians or psychologists and so forth could benefit from what the discovery of the research, or at least the conclusion and summary pieces of the research were. Dan was brilliant at sharing that. And I think you're right. I think at that point, I remember in talking to Dan said, I got all these requests about, can I take this into business and industry? Can I bring this into the schools? Can I take this into healthcare? And I had never been that, that was a competency that was not part of who I was or what I was doing. And so then he partnered with Richard Boyatzis, and Richard, who had been working in industry and was one of the founding fathers, mothers, whatever, but one of the founders of competency management, began to look at this through the lens that he was so familiar with. And all of a sudden we were looking at emotional and now social competencies. And so they were able to then start to work like that. But then a whole cadre of people, myself, yourself, others, became pioneers. And so what do we do with this?
Yeah.
How do we make this useful? I mean, even about the brain. So we understand there's an amygdala, and it gets hijacked sometimes, and sometimes we have this what feels like an out of body experience. We're kind of looking at ourselves saying, "I can't believe I'm doing these things, but darn, I'm doing them." So you have those moments where you just feel like, "Holy cow, I can't believe how emotional I got." Sometimes I'll ask people when I'm speaking to large groups, I'll say, "How many of you can remember the last time you were really emotional?" Right? So a bunch of people will put their hands up in the air, and I'll say, well, keep your hands up if you also felt you were intelligent in those moments. And most people's hands come down then, right? Because most of the time we think about being emotional, we don't think about being intelligent. We think about being a bit out of control at times. So what is emotional intelligence, and how does it come into play? And what are you teaching? When you teach about it at the university, what is it you want your students to learn? What is it you want to tell them about it?
Well, the first point for me is on the rational side, and it seems a joke, but it's not. I mean, it's easier to use the channel ready to learn. So let's start with the overall picture. Let's see that there's an amygdala, there's a cortex, and so on. So the scientific explanation. Consider I work a lot with engineers, so this foundation is, of course, the first point. And then you see some simple rules, some tips about, for instance, take charge of your emotional state when you enter the room. And that's something we can check every time we see it. I mean, how do you feel? And then the question, how do you feel, is not who cares about feelings. It's because emotions are contagious. And if I'm bored, the risk is that I'm going to transfer this kind of emotion. If I, in an anger state, I risk to, the anxiety risk to be transferred to people. And so the understanding of these simple things and some check-ins, for instance, it's a way to create familiarity and create a language. The opportunity for people to talk about emotion without feeling that it's not appropriate, or the risk is to be seen as weak, as leaders, and so on. So the idea is to have the literacy and the language to talk about something important. And it's important because we have described the overall functioning of the brain. So it's something scientific, and then the questions and the check-ins and the routines we can have in our class is something useful. Then there's a self-awareness part. Let's reflect about that. We can use some workbooks or some questionnaires in order to think about our kind of emotional intelligence. And sometimes I'm not so interested about your level of emotional intelligence, but how is your emotional intelligence term? Are you self-aware, but you are struggling with the managing of your emotion or whatever? And the other issue, the other topic is about authenticity. Because when you act as a scientist, if you are not, people think about, it's strange, he's not natural. What's behind this kind of dialogue? What is the hidden agenda he has? And so the point is, okay, guys, I'm quite aware of my characteristics and I'm trying to practice. I know that you are different from me. So I'm a scientist, you are a superhero, or just use the word you want. How can we find a way to work together, starting from different point of view? And that's so important to say that we're different and we need to find a way, because I'm not right, you are not wrong. I mean, we're different and this is it. And so find a way to work with different people, with different styles. It's really the real challenge. But we can think about that in terms of partnership. Of course, as a leader, I'm in charge of the results. But the idea is, okay, guys, let's try to find a way to work together. And so I have this kind of style. I know that I have some strengths, some weaknesses. I have some opportunities, some threats in terms of my leadership role. Okay, that's the awareness. And then we need to find a way to work together, because we don't need to be perfect. Sometimes people tell me, oh, you are an expert. Well, I'm a practitioner. I mean, from a rational point of view, I'm an expert because I've read lots of research. But in terms of practice, I'm still practicing because I'm not perfect. I mean, I have a trainer in my family, is my son, 17 years old son. It's a perfect coach because has he challenged my amygdala? No one is capable to do it. But I mean, it's a practice. It's a way to practice. It's a way to train my reaction.
It's interesting. So sometimes when I'm coaching people and I'm talking to them about, some really significant challenges they face with certain individuals, I encourage them to think about this. This is a great opportunity to practice these skills we're talking about. This person is giving you so much opportunity to have the opportunity to learn and to grow, because they challenge you in multiple ways, and you want to find the ways that you can react appropriately. You get challenges every day. It's what a great opportunity for you. So try to lighten the load a little bit when you're dealing with really things that are pretty tough to actually manage. But you talked about a number of things really, and the way I think about this is often people are trying to be smarter about how they manage emotions. I think a lot of people have at least thought about that. I think they struggle with, as you said, we're trying to make this sound somewhat simplistic. And and the roadmap was about that. That was trying to take the theory out of that 1990 journal article that had it was a very specific definition of emotional intelligence that, as you read it, I had to read it like 3 or 4 times to really try to understand what it said. But at the same time, I thought, actually, what it seems to say is it's important to know what we're feeling. It's important to understand how those feelings are impacting how we're thinking. It's important to understand how those emotions are being created and how we might change them. And it's important to manage them. I mean, that's sort of what it said, but it was much tougher to actually hear. So trying to simplify and make something come alive for people. And yet there's no question it's challenging. I got to say, one of the most greatest moments of my radio talk show over the years I've been doing this came in about 7 months ago. Someone called me and told me, he said, Chuck, how long have you been on the air? And I said, well, since 2009. So anyway, 13 years. And he said, I've been listening to you since you started. And I want you to know I raised my son based on what I learned from you. And he's a hell of a kid these days. And he was dealing with something he wanted to tell me about. But it was, Max, it was like, the whole idea of going on the radio was, hey, maybe people who can't afford to pay a consultant to come in or a professor to come in and teach them can learn from just the experience of over the years listening. And that was one of the great moments for me, because he had taken what I had talked about. And it was funny. He said, I actually called your show earlier, a number of years ago, and you helped me with something that I don't even remember what it was, but I know I did what you said and it helped. I said, well, that's kind of funny that you don't remember it. And because I thought, well, what does that really mean? And he said, but isn't that the point? Isn't that the point? I didn't need to remember it because it got fixed because of what I learned from it. So I thought, well, okay. That was one of the best calls I've had in many years. That was pretty important. So I think it's learnable, and that's what Peter Salovey says too. One of the things he did, or he came on my radio show. Peter, by the way, for those who don't know, he's one of the pioneers. He and Jack Mayer were the two people that wrote the original article in 1990 that introduced emotional intelligence, the idea of an intelligence about emotions to the world. And now Peter's the president of Yale University. But anyway, so he came on the radio show. He said, Chuck, one of the reasons people, well, first of all, he likes the roadmap. He said it's a good way to benefit people, but the reason it benefits people and why they like it is because this is something you can get better at. That's why people gravitate to this, because it's something you can learn how to be better at managing your own emotions and how you influence others. And that's why I think we're doing the work we're doing. I think it's important to realize that in a world that's so troubled, and all of the polarization that's happening within countries, across countries, between countries, within families, across families, in the workplace, with all the polarization, I think it's so important to try to help people to manage their emotional response to all the craziness that's around us, and then help make it better by being able to influence not just ourselves, but others as well.
And the real challenge for me now, from a scientific point of view, we know a lot. Now it's time to practice. And with the really easy tips, for instance, we discussed before, what kind of mood you want to bring when you enter in the company or in a meeting room. I mean, it's about, okay, if I have a time to commute, how can I use this time in order to be in the right mood? And the right mood is not happiness always. Because, of course, if I have to have a meeting with the sales force, we are in November, we are under budget, probably anger could be useful in order to create an energy. If I have to share a bad feedback with a person, probably a little bit of sadness could permit to create a better empathy with this person. So it's not about an always right emotion, but the emotions that you want to feel in that moment because you believe, and maybe you are wrong, but you are deliberate in deciding, I want to create this level of mood around me in the company. But it's the same when you enter at home in the evening. What kind of emotion you want to share with people? Because maybe you need 10 minutes in your garage and to listen to some music alone or whatever. But when you enter, what's the kind of feeling you want to share with your spouse, with your children, and so on? So right. It's not something complex in theory, but it's hard to do it when you are under pressure with lots of challenges around you, goals to accomplish, and so on. But it's a practice. And of course, it's right, Peter Salovey. And by the way, Peter Salovey, it's always right. But to say that we can train, we can practice. And of course, emotional results could be improved. I don't know about the intelligence, but that's academics struggle in thinking. But of course, the performance could be improved. No doubts about that.
So let's talk some about teams, because we've talked in general about emotional intelligence. Teams are struggling today with the idea that there's a lot of people in remote locations now. And I know it's happened in your country as well as in ours. And people are kind of redefining what it means to be a team in the sense of, how do I be an effective team member? Part of it was I have some pretty good social skills, and I would exercise those when I was just walking down the hallway and just visiting with somebody just by accident. But in that moment, we had a chance to chat, and we chatted about families and friends and sports and music and other things that we enjoy. But all of a sudden, we're talking about the business, and we find opportunities to just have innovative conversations, which produce sometimes really meaningful dialogue that results in something positive for the organization. That's out the window for many people today because of the COVID restrictions and so forth. What is your experience of teams, and What have you learned about teams, and how is that impacting what's happening today?
Well, let me say, Chuck, that my first wave was about emotional intelligence and leadership. The second one was about emotional intelligence and change. And the third one is about teams and how to apply emotional intelligence to teams. Because I'm really convinced that in a so complex environment, we need teams in order to deliver. Because now it's too complex for the individual alone, because sometimes innovation is at the merge to different kind of disciplines and so on. And so we need other people in order to succeed right now in the corporate environment. That's one of my strong convictions. And so years ago, I started to think about how to apply emotional intelligence to teams. And my first idea was, if we have an average emotional intelligence inside the team that is high, then we have an emotional intelligence team. And data are not supporting this statement. Because, of course, the emotional intelligence of the leader is important. But what is really crucial in order to have performance for team is the level of culture they created. So the level of emotional intelligence norms they are able to create and to maintain inside the team. Because, culture is the written or not written rules behind behaviors inside a group. And so the idea is we need to create this kind of norms, this kind of emotional norms, because of course a team is an incubator of emotions. We know that how our emotions are leveraged by interaction of people. And think about a team where you are worried about the perception of the other people, about your competencies, about your kindness, and other things. So team is so an interesting unit to study in order to understand the emotional contagions. And I was working on all these things in order to find a model. I'm quite rational oriented, as I told you. And so the idea is, okay, let's try to find a model. Let's try to find a way to simplify once again. And so I was working on the Tuckman model, is 1975. So not the last model discovered, but it's quite easy to use. And so we decided to use it. So the model is based on stages of teams. And so the first one is you have to form the team. The second one is be ready to have a storm, because it's normal to struggle when you start working with other people. Then you find a way to work with others is the norm phase, and then you have the performance. And my challenge was, how can we arrive to the performance stage as soon as possible? Because now when we start with a team, a project, and so on, the idea is we start today, but we want the delivery tomorrow. We have not so much time in order to learn how to work together. And so I was working on all these topics, and then COVID. All the people around the world in smart working or with lots of pressure, fears, and so on. And so the idea was, okay, probably we found a way to support team in presence. And what can we do now with hybrid models and so on? So we collect data, lots of data in Italy. So I cannot say that is working in the same way around the world, because our sample is an Italian-based sample. But what we discovered is quite interesting, because we have found that the perception of empathy is really, really decreased. The perception of understanding of our own emotion is decreasing. And the idea of trust, the perception of trust is lower than ever.
Wow.
But looking at this data and with a regression, I don't want to go on the technical side of these things, but the idea is let's try to find the cause. So let's try to find equations in order to explain the differences between a good team and a bad team. What is the difference? Nowadays, the idea is that trust is less important for winning teams. It doesn't mean it's not important, but it's less important than pre-COVID. And the real point now is the process of collaborations. So let me say really in a brutal way, and I'm sorry, but it seems that there's a shift in order to perform from self-awareness to self-management in terms of individuals, and from trust to process, collaboration process in terms of norms and social capitals. It's more important the process now, because the more we work online, the more we need to give people the idea that there's a process, there's some steps you have to go through. And so the idea to have something that is easier to understand in terms of what's next is the real key point in terms of team performance.
So you think that the enhancement of collaboration processes early on introduced to remote teams is going to generate more, I guess, profitability, productivity, whatever goals you might have for the particular group. And that's demonstrated in some of the research you're doing?
Yep. And satisfaction too. Because, when we are not in the same room, you know that the activation of your amygdala is a little bit different. And it's the point that we can make when we see people chatting or talking, but they are not in the same room. The level of courage, let me say courage, or I could use other words, but I mean, the fear is lower. For instance, with my guys at the university, I have usually 200 engineers per year. And when in the first lesson, I say to people, okay, any questions? Of course, I have no questions, because if you want to ask a question in front of 200 people, it's a public speaking exercise. You fear of the judgment of others about how you wear, how you speak, and so on. So no question when we are in the plenary session. Then after, lots of people came near me and said, Professor, I have a question, but not before. Now, me and you, of course. And so the idea is now I want to have a chat, even if I'm in the same room with 200 people, because they can write a question and the barrier are lower. So the idea is there's less fear when we work, each of us in our home and so on. The point is, in order to obtain satisfaction, to be consistent, to know exactly what's next, and so on. So working more on the process now from my data is the real key of success. So if you work with Agile, for instance, if you love Agile project management, that's great. You just need to add the emotional side to task management. So you have a brilliant task management in Agile management, but then you need to add the emotional side. But the idea to have a strong process is, for me, the real point now.
Well, so that's very exciting actually to hear, Max, in terms of some concrete understanding of what's changing and how we might respond proactively to address those changes in a very constructive way, as opposed to just feeling bad that we don't have this experience of being all together which has been more typical. One of the things that you and I have talked about this, when I work with Tuckman's model of forming, when your group first gets together, how do they become a team? The storming part, which is, of course, you're going to have conflict. Now the question is, after everybody started off and was so happy to be together, now all of a sudden we realize that, hey, we don't all agree on everything. And so now we have to figure out, how do we process that? And sometimes we don't process that well. And so we have to figure out some ways that we regulate how we process that. And that's where we get into the norming stage. And then finally, how do we perform? And there's other there's other extensions. How do we deform, reform, whatever, that have been added years later. But it's still the four-part model works for me. And I always thought, what's the emotion when we first get together? And so I think you can still use that, which is like when we're forming a team and it's in one place, sometimes people have certain feelings, and that's sort of what you're talking about a bit here, which it's like a public speaking exercise, smaller group than 200, but it's still, you're in front of a group. Now, if you're just in a Zoom window or a team window, it's a little different for you, and you're in your home base, and you have a little more confidence perhaps. So the dynamic emotionally is changing. Yeah. With the remote locations, and you've given us some really concrete ideas about ways that you can innovatively address that. That's really rich. I really think that's great. I think one of the other things that I've often thought about, and this is kind of unique to what you just said, is that when we approach trust, one of the exercises I'll do with a group, if I'm working with them long enough, is I'll ask, okay, on a 1 to 10 scale, you're just about to meet somebody new that you're going to work with. Do you approach them as fully trusting of any new person you're about to meet and work with? At a 10 level, you're completely trusting them? Or are you at sort of a 1 level where you got to prove to me you're worth trusting? I don't really trust anybody until I've had some concrete evidence that I can trust you. And even then, it has to be over time. And then for most people, they're not a 1 or a 10, but they're somewhere they're not a 5. They're somewhere either I lack trust in the beginning or I give more trust on the front end in the beginning. And then why? What in your life experience causes you to have that belief about trust? Because people are different. And I ask people to talk to each other about it. And then if I have time, just listening to what causes people to be on one side or the other of that line. But what you're speaking to, I think it says doesn't matter so much anymore. Because what matters is how we're going to work together collaboratively from a remote location.
Yeah, the real risks, the real risk, in my opinion, is to try to use the old models to the new situation.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, the psychological safety when you are at home or when you are in the meeting room is different. And we need to consider it. It's different. And data shows us that this difference has an impact on results. And so, of course, now we're thinking, generally speaking, to hybrid or remote or in presence. What does it mean exactly is to define in each situation. But of course, you cannot do a team building exercise when you start working remotely. But you have to find a way to create this forming phase. Because, of course, we know that for each team, we need the fundamentals. Fundamentals are the purpose, why we are here together, what we have to accomplish, the goal, the roles, and so on. That's, of course, are the basics. Then we need to understand the we as a team, and find a way, a common ground to discuss about we, and then go step by step on the model. We talked about Tuckman, we can use another model, but the point is to permit people to say, okay, now we are here, and in 1 month we want to go there. And in order to be there, we need to collect data in order to be sure we are, of course, on the same page, and discuss and permit people to know each other, but in a different way. Because, of course, if we are in the same room with a drink or a glass of water and talk is different, and you cannot recreate the same feeling online. And by the way, when you can, of course, the hybrid model is better. because when you have the opportunity to stay in the same room, you can create and strengthen relations. For instance, we met more or less 1 month ago in Boston, and it was a pleasure. It's a way to reinforce and strengthen our relation. And now it's easy to talk by Zoom, but not always is possible. And so the reality is like it is. And so you need to work with what you have, not what you would like to have.
Well, I'm going to have to close there because we actually the 55 minutes have gone by, and Max, it's been great. I really appreciate having you on. And is there anything left that you'd like to say in closing before I say goodbye to the listeners?
Yes, that it was a pleasure to talk with you today.
Thanks, Max. Thank you, everybody, for listening. You've been listening to Chuck Wolf. My guest has been Max Ghini, University of Bologna award-winning professor. And it's just been a conversation about emotional intelligence around the world, and also about teams and COVID and some of the really interesting findings Max has about what are some of the strategies we might use going forward for the new reality that we're in. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Again, Chuck Wolf, the Emotion Roadmap. Take the wheel and control how you feel on WPKN 89.5 FM and streaming WPKN.org. Thanks, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.